So I am Peter Larson, and I'm here with Stephen Gowans, an independent researcher from Ottawa. Stephen, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us today.
It's a pleasure, Peter.
Stephen is, as you say, an independent researcher. He's the author of a number of different books on, I'll call it on foreign policy, international relations generally. And his most recent book, which I have here beside me, is called Israel, a Beachhead in the Middle East. And it's an interesting book. And you have some, what I think many people will consider to be controversial ideas in the book. And I wanted to quiz you a little bit about that tonight. Okay. Stephen, the one that struck me the most was it's a whole debate about who controls U.S. foreign policy, and by extension, I guess you could say Canadian foreign policy as well. Does Israel control the policy? Does Israel dictate the policy, or can you explain U.S. foreign policy, the extensive support for Israel, in another way? And you argue that many people have that causality upside down. Can you explain a little bit what you think and why you think it?
Yeah. There is a view that is current in some circles that Israel, and in particular the Israeli lobby in the United States, has an inordinate influence over the United States foreign policy in the Middle East. Some have even gone to the extent of saying that U.S. involvement in Syria is entirely driven by Israel. And I suppose others would also argue, not suppose, I know that some have argued that the reason the United States has a terrorism problem, as they call it, is because of Israel and because of U.S. support for Israel, and that U.S. interests are not consistent with those of Israel, and the reason, therefore, that the United States is supporting Israel is because its foreign policy has been hijacked by this enormously influential Israeli lobby. And I call that the Judeo-Israeli theory of U.S. foreign policy. And I think that this policy, or this theory, offers a gateway of escape through which liberal Democrats or liberals can avoid confrontation with the reality that the United States is an imperialist country. It safeguards their illusion that the country is committed to democracy and self-determination and freedom from tyranny. But, the view that the United States is a liberal democratic society fails to accord with the facts. While Washington claims to promote self-determination, it has, over the 2 centuries or more of its existence, continually intervened in the affairs of other countries and of other peoples. It's conquered their territory, it's overthrown governments, it's dominated foreign economies and politics and cultural life. And, while the United States professes to champion democracy, some of its greatest allies have been and are dictatorships. Military dictatorships, monarchies, which are essentially dictatorships, civilian dictatorships as well. And then there's Israel, to which Washington extends robust support. It's not a liberal democracy. And some of the people who make the argument that Israel is controlling U.S. Foreign policy point this out.
But Stephen, you don't deny, or do you, that there is such a thing as an Israel lobby in the United States, and that organizations like AIPAC are enormously influential? Would you contest that?
No, not at all. There is a very large lobby, AIPAC, as you say, and it is influential. But there are other large lobbies in the United States as well. There's the National Rifle Association. There's the Retired People's Association. There's the Business Roundtable. There are an enormous number of lobbies in the United States that exert considerable influence. Well, AIPAC seems large when you juxtapose it against many other lobbies in the United States, the Chamber of Commerce, for example. It doesn't seem that big.
Okay, but can I just push back a little bit? I got your point. There's a defense lobby and so on and so forth, but all those other lobbies don't have their people as ambassadors to Israel or leading a peace process or I think it can be easily argued that many of the senior people in the Trump administration are very decidedly pro-Israel. I don't think there's any contest there.
No, there isn't. They are pro-Israel. The question is, why are they pro-Israel? Which is kind of the point that I'm trying to make, or I was trying to make. And why are they pro-Israel? We have to look at the interests of the United States versus the interests of Israel. The United States and Israel have a complementarity of interests in the Middle East. But I'll say where their interests conflict, Israeli interests yield to those of the United States. But what are those interests? Israel, as a state, self-consciously representing the world's Jews, seeks to claim territory it believes was promised to Jews by their God, and territory extending from, say, the Nile to the Euphrates. So it has these territorial aspirations. The United States' goal is to internationalize free enterprise under U.S. corporate leadership. So that is to spread its commercial and financial tentacles to all corners of the world, regardless of whether the peoples of all corners of the world are agreeable to this. Now, it happens that the territory that Israel aspires to acquire, and that has acquired, belongs or once belonged to Arab governments or Arab forces of national assertiveness that are opposed to the expansion of U.S. economic, political, and cultural frontiers in the Middle East. So these include Egypt, under the Arab nationalist Gamal Abdel Nasser. It included Iraq under the Ba'athist Saddam government. And today it includes Syria under the Ba'athist Assad government and Lebanon under the influence of Hezbollah. So Israel covets their territory as an expanded homeland for the Jews. Washington covets their territory for economic reasons. So a market for U.S. goods and services, including for the sale of arms, a sphere of U.S. investment, transportation routes for Persian Gulf oil. Now Israel, accepts this U.S. open door policy that everyone should open their door to U.S. economic influence. But Israeli expansion into these territories then serves both Israeli and U.S. interests. So there's this complementarity of goals. They both essentially seek the same thing for different reasons, but they do aspire or seek the same goals, to achieve the same goals. I think one of the problems when people think about this is they assume that if U.S. Middle East policy serves Israeli interests, they're assuming implicitly that Israeli and U.S. interests are therefore mutually exclusive, failing to recognize that Israeli interests are often U.S. interests and vice versa.
Stephen, you haven't mentioned in that, you've emphasized U.S. commercial interests, expanding markets and so on, but you haven't mentioned oil. And for many years, people thought, well, the U.S. was there because it needed the oil. And now, as you know, in more recent times, the United States has become itself independent of doesn't need to import oil, or at least doesn't need to import oil from that region. So what is the U.S. interest? Is there a U.S. interest about oil or not? And if so, how does Israel play in that?
Yes, there is a U.S. interest in oil, and that interest is an economic interest. It's an investment interest. Persian Gulf oil is, as one State Department official once put it, a stupendous treasure and strategic resource. It's a source of enormous profits for U.S. oil companies. It's also a strategic resource in the sense that control over Persian Gulf oil provides the United States with essentially control over the energy sources of Japan and Western Europe. Japan and Western Europe, and also China to a certain extent, are dependent upon oil from the Persian Gulf. The United States is not highly dependent. In fact, today really isn't dependent at all on Persian Gulf oil. The United States is one of the world's leading producers of oil. I can't recall if it's number one today or number two or number three, but it has never been highly dependent upon the Persian Gulf as a source of energy. Western Europe, Japan have been. So if you control that oil, you also have control over Western Europe and Japan. But equally importantly, has been an enormous source of profits for U.S. oil corporations. And also important are the transportation routes from the Persian Gulf to Western Europe and Japan. It's important that the United States has control over those routes to ensure they don't fall into the hands of rivals or into the hands of local forces of independence and national assertiveness.
But how does that lead the United States to need to support Israel at great cost? How does that advance that interest?
Well, local forces of, as I call them, local forces of independence and national assertiveness. These are Arab nationalist forces. In countries that that Israel seeks the territory of, and one of Israel's roles as part of the U.S. empire is to, I think, as one U.S. or Israeli politician put it, the role of Israel is to ensure that it would be the rock against which Arab nationalism would be broken. So if we look at Israel's history of wars, it means had wars with the Six-Day War, for example, in 1967 was a war with Egypt, which was the leading Arab nationalist force at the time, and also Syria, which was also an Arab nationalist force and remains an Arab nationalist force. Israel is also has a hostile relationship with Lebanon, in particular with Hezbollah, which we could characterize as an Arab nationalist force as well.
Iran.
And Iran, because Iran is a force for, national assertiveness, local independence. I kind of lost track of your question here.
No, I was
going on too long.
My question was, the United States spends a lot of money on Israel. It's only $3 billion in defense expenditure. This is it also incurs quite a bit of enmity, if not amongst Arab leaders, certainly on the Arab street. And so its support of Israel has a cost. And what's the benefit of the United States? That's the question I'm asking you.
Right, and it's not a significant cost, really. It's $3.8 billion per year at the moment. The cost of maintaining an U.S. aircraft or and the name escapes me all of a sudden of this simple thing. Aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier strike group is about the same, about $3.8 million. So what the United States invests in Israel in terms of military aid is about the same as what it would invest in an aircraft carrier strike group. Some U.S. politicians have pointed out that Israel has the value of about 5 aircraft carriers. And how much is the United States paying? $3.8 billion, so they pay essentially the equivalent of 1 aircraft carrier. Israel acts
but the United States does not have soldiers or airmen and so on in Israel, correct? It's not quite like an aircraft carrier.
Well, it is like an aircraft carrier because Israel acts on behalf of the United States. Israel carries out the United States commands. Does Israel ever behave in a way that's inconsistent with U.S. strategic interests? Does Israel have enemies that aren't the same as the enemies that the United States has. And 3.8 billion is not as if the United States is simply handing them 3.8 billion dollars and saying, spend it as you wish. That's essentially a subsidy to the US arms industry. The money goes from Washington right to US arms manufacturers, and then they take that money and they produce equipment and they send it over to Israel. So this is a subsidy for US arms manufacturers, which is essentially arming an extension of the Pentagon.
Well, Stephen, your thesis is radical. I think a number of people will find it goes against what their initial thinking is, and I encourage them to consider taking a look at your book where you argue it a bit more. And I want to thank you very much for spending 15 minutes with us tonight, outlining your analysis of the dynamics between Israel and the United States. So, Stephen Gowans, independent researcher in Ottawa, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.